I would just like to welcome you, Bas, to the TU Wien Online lecture. We are really looking forward to hear from you as a researcher, but also practicing landscape architect. What are the key aspects of how can landscape architecture actually implement the current status quo of the environment? We are looking forward to see your projects and to somehow have a glimpse into your research/practice, research-focused practice. I'd just like to ask Jakob to extend the introduction, and then we would like to see a short presentation of around 45 minutes, and then we have the discussion, if that's fine.
Yes, perfect. One question before we start, because since I'm co-host, I see people in the waiting room. You let them in, Jakob, or so?
Yeah, I just keep letting them in. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So I don't bother.
Yeah, no, it's all good. they might still be popping up. Okay, so yeah, also from my side, thank you very much for joining. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce you today. I think I've also been following your work for quite a while, particularly since I've had the pleasure to visit one of your works, which is now in progress, the Parc des Ateliers in Arles. So I will just briefly introduce Bas's background. Bas received a master's degree in architecture and civil engineering from the University of Leuven and a postgraduate qualification in landscape architecture from the University of Geneva. He founded his office in Brussels in 2007 and has since constructed projects in more than 12 countries with his team of 17 architects and landscape architects. His realized projects include the large park of Thurn Taxis in Brussels, the Himara Waterfront in Albania, the Sunken Garden, and the Mandrake Hotel in London. A number of large projects are currently under construction: the plaza of the new Trinity Tower in Paris, and the aforementioned Parc des Ateliers in Arles for the Luma Foundation, which is done in close collaboration with Frank Gehry and Annabelle Selldorf. Artistic and scientific research takes a central role in his endeavors. He has worked with many artists, among others Philippe Pareno, for whom he has designed the film sets for the movie Continuously Habitable Zones. Amongst numerous recognitions, he was awarded the Biennial Prize for Young Landscape Architects from the French Ministry of Culture in 2008, and the Award for Urbanism from the French Academy of Architecture 10 years later. As Bas puts it, his work aims to invent so-called augmented landscapes by using the logics of nature in an attempt to create more resilient environments, as well as to produce research into the possible roles of landscape projects for changing climate. So without further ado, the stage is yours, Bas.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to share our ideas, our research with new universities, and this is the first time in Vienna, so very happy to meet all you guys. As was said in the introduction, I will speak more about research and the office as a laboratory than specifically explaining projects, because I do see this whole endeavor as a research into the ambition and the role of landscape architecture. What can we do, what should we do, and how should we do it? I will start with a brief introduction of not my work, but other people's work. This is Roger van der Weyde, a Flemish painter, 15th century, that basically invented landscape. Because it's interesting to know that the word landscape was used for the first time not to speak about physical reality, not about what is there, but about an invention of what could be there. And how did they do that? Van der Weyde cut out these windows of the frame he was commissioned to do. This frame here was Chancelier Rollin, which you can see here, the Chancellor, next to the Madonna with the baby. That was his commission, but he decided to make this frame and then make a kind of imagined landscape with a river, a boat, mountains. I mean, he was living in the Low Country, so he'd not seen these mountains. He was not painting from a reality, but making an imagined landscape. And I think it's really important to understand that the word landscape comes from an imagination of a possible reality and not of that reality itself. Here we're 100 years later, Joachim Pattenier, who supposedly, according to Dürer, was the first landscape painter. You can see his commission is the flight out of Egypt, and you can see he reduced his commission to about, I calculated it once, about 8%, and the 92 other percent he is enjoying himself exploring atmospheric perspective, as you can see here, going from the ochre to the green to the blue, still a bit clumsy in this painting. He's enjoying himself painting rocks rather than painting his commission. Again, 100 years later, we are here with the same commission. Back then, there was about 10 or 20 themes that always came back. This time it's Bruegel, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and who in a masterly way makes this atmospheric perspective and makes you believe you're in the Alps or on some kind of imagined landscape. Again, Bruegel lived most of his life in Antwerp and in Brussels, in the totally flat country that we know, and so was exploring again with using elements he had seen on his travels into a composition, into an imaginary landscape. Again, I go 100 years later, Claude Le Lorrain, who is depicting scenes not that he had seen, but that he had read in Virgil. So again, landscape based on imagination. Or here, Turner, again, 100 years later, a brief kind of hopping through landscape paintings, who's painting the mist on the Thames, but is more interested in the meteorological effects of the Thames than really depicting it. And it's interesting to know that Oscar Wilde wrote about Turner, saying that we needed Turner to be able to see the mist on the Thames, and he develops this theory that you need an artist to see reality, in which he says life imitates art rather than art imitates life. And I think that's also a very important element, that this landscape as an imagination makes you see reality in a different way and makes you interact in reality in a different way. With that brief introduction into the meaning of landscape, I go to two important inspirations in my work, and two important moments, I would say, in the research of possibilities of landscape. One is Alexander von Humboldt, who maybe was the first person to really try to understand the relationship between everything. This is a very famous painting of the Chimborazo volcano, where per altitude he tried to measure everything he could, from air temperature to humidity, to the blueness of the sky, to the type of vegetation that would grow there, to the cultivation of that land. He was interested in a kind of cross reading of all data to then formulate principles, which he was very good at, and his work was absolutely necessary for Darwin. Who very often referred in his letters, in his writings, to Alexander von Humboldt being the kind of model he was looking up to. And I'm showing von Humboldt because this idea of trying to understand how things are related, I think, is essential in the making of landscapes. Very beautiful images. Also, this idea of making a new type of imaginary. And he was also at the basis of the isothermal chart, really trying to understand the planet as the object of research. From Humboldt, I go to Viollet-le-Duc, which you may know, French architect, known for the renovation of the most important churches and cathedrals in France, among them Notre Dame, the spiral that came down. But he was also a traveler in mostly in the Mont Blanc mountains, and and he was always trying to redraw them for 10 years. It was this kind of research project trying to understand decomposition of mountains, how glaciers would flow, and he made this map, and I was lucky enough to be able to buy one of these original maps, where he tried to redraw the Mont Blanc. Back then there was no satellite photography, of course, and no images of it. He tried to redraw it, but also to repair it. And in a sense, what I think was fascinating with Viollet-le-Duc is that he saw architecture just, I mean, he would look at ancient architecture like the Notre Dame and try to bring it back to its best form. But he would do the same with mountains, like nature as architects making things that then can be made better. And so from these two, let's say, inspirations, we go to the physical reality in which we work. Well, this is Europe. And so I come from here, from Brussels. And as you can see, it's a kind of a different condition within Europe. We're in a flat country. There's no resistance from natural elements. And so I remember the first essay I wrote when I started the office was Strategies for a Land Without a Landscape, since the flatness doesn't create any restrictions to development. So landscape in a way as a way of organizing the territory. So we've been doing that within Belgium, but also outside of Belgium. And today I want to show you a couple of projects, one in Albania, two in the United Kingdom, and two in France. Oh yeah, and then, well, yeah, then we've been working a bit all over. I'm just showing this because what I like about this approach is that we're not exporting a product, but we're applying a methodology. It's always the same methodology, and whether it's in LA or whether it's in Moscow, it's the same way of looking at things and the same way of exploring possible realities within the built environment. The first project I want to show you is in Albania. It's right here. It's a city called Himara next to Corfu. Here you see the boot of Italy. Beautiful coastline, unspoiled, because Albania being closed to foreigners for such a long time, opening up right now. And there was this competition organized by Ateliers Albania, where local teams could team up with international teams to make proposals. And we went to this town, which was in a way quite surprisingly not taking advantage of its location next to the Mediterranean, which you can see right here. There was a couple of steps, as you can see, to come down from the waterfront to the beach, but mainly it was a retaining wall 2 meters high, on which they had built a road, on which they had built parking spaces, on which they had, strangely enough, made planters with then olive trees or even these palm trees. And so basically sitting at the bars and the restaurants of this quite okay town, you could hardly see the water because you would see cars, little walls, and especially the retaining wall or the seawall, if you like, that wouldn't allow you to see the water. And of course, being there, we were dreaming of this kind of situation, beautiful pine trees, rocks, water, as you could find further along the coast. So, and I'm showing this because the whole idea came quite quickly, where we said, well, we just have to break down the retaining wall, change it with a number of steps. We spoke to maritime engineers who said that this would even be better to absorb the shock of the waves, because you would absorb it on different layers and not only by a vertical wall. Then we checked the groundwater layer to see where we could plant those trees. And this section we then applied on the 350 meters length of the waterfront, as you can see in this scheme. And we massively planted those trees to create a new, actually what I wanted to do, as I showed in this reference image, is that for people being in the Mediterranean, I would like them to see trees before they would see the buildings, because the buildings, they were okay, but I mean, not amazing. So this was the drawing or the perspective from the competition. This is construction side. And here you can see how this new grove of trees create a new screen. They also create shade, so for people going to the water, they can sit here on those benches. And especially from the waterfront to the beach, one single space in those different bands that we made with concrete, in which we use the sand from the beach. So as if the sand or the beach was solidified all the way to the facades. And as you can see, since we've built it, new restaurants have sprung up, new hotels. They even made a kind of charter for what kind of umbrellas they could use. And so suddenly the whole place became a much more joyful place where the water is visible everywhere and accessible everywhere. So here you see the view where before you would see the cars, you can see the ocean. I like this view too, with the umbrella pines and the real umbrellas, if you like. And the curve was based on the reading of the breaking of the waves of the Mediterranean. So in a sense, very smooth, but very much in dialogue with the physical reality of the site. Back then, they absolutely wanted me to keep the road here. I kept it almost secretly, as if you like, on one of the bands, because I knew they would close it once the project was built. And indeed, they close it off, except for emergency entrance, of course. And so the accessible road becomes part of the whole scheme. So I like this image a lot, where as again we made a landscape in front of the waterfront, rather than making a waterfront in front of the buildings. You see the pine trees. You also see a couple of plane trees on the little plazas that were there. We punctuated the kind of horizontal line of the pines with those plazas with plane trees. So one single section that basically organized the whole intervention. From the 350 meter long waterfront, I go to a very small project, 4 meters by 8 meters. I think it's one of the smallest we have done. A sunken courtyard in the center of London, surrounded by quite high facades, where the client asked us to transform this stone, damp, cold courtyard into a lush garden. And I had this kind of hunch, being there during the renovation of the facades, that there was a kind of strange climate, because there was no sunlight, but also no wind. And since it was surrounded by this old facades with their old windows, I thought there was a kind of little heat effect in the courtyard. And so I asked the foreman doing the construction of the renovation of the facades to take the temperature in the garden or in the courtyard and outside on the street. And you could see there would be a 3 to 4 degree difference during winter. And even during rain, you would see there would be 3 to 4 degrees warmer in the courtyard because of its protected situation. And so I took the risk that it would not freeze inside. And of course, freezing or not freezing is a whole different type of vegetation. And so we did some more climatic studies to understand that the temperature and the condition in the courtyard is quite close to an understory of a subtropical forest, meaning that in our case, the surrounding buildings are like the big tree canopy, and underneath are growing this understory. And so we chose trees from New Zealand, Dixonia Antarctica. Those are giant tree ferns that grow underneath the canopy of the higher trees. There was also a request for a terrace. Of course, I didn't want to make a kind of a too modern terrace. And I started looking for the right type of stone. We checked the pavements outside, and they're all made in the 18th, 19th century with York stone. So we found the quarry that had delivered them and went to choose not pavers, but rocks that we then craned in to the courtyard. The trees as well. So here, I like this image a lot. These trees flying over London, all craned in to create this piece of nature that more and more in my mind became the last piece of prehistorical landscape, untouched, as if the building had been built around it. You see the slabs and the trees at plantation. The client decided to put an art piece in there by Franz West, which perfectly contrasts with these kind of prehistoric bark of those tree ferns. And so here you see every hour we put in 1 minute of mist. Since there was no wind, the mist stayed there, and it became really this kind of little piece of a very strange climate and atmosphere, which again was totally based on the reading of the climatic conditions and enhancing those conditions. So here you see it when I went there first at construction sites, when they were renovating the buildings. And then this is when it was finished. And then years later, because it's one of our first projects in 2010. You see here a nice picture by François Allard for Architectural Digest, where you can see that the Franz West is like, help, help, sticking out one hand. And you see how the tree ferns have grown amazingly in this courtyard. So, well, in Albania, everything was based on a section. Here, everything was based on a reading of the temperature. This idea we explored a couple of years later in a hotel in London. The hotel is called the Mandrake, and it's a transformation of an old office building into a boutique hotel. And the client wanted something very special in his courtyard. His first idea was a gigantic tree, and I remember he called me and it's a great client, super motivated. He was like, "Bas, I want the Garden of Eden on drugs." I was like, "Okay, what does that mean?" And so I was thinking the tree would always introduce scale, and the moment you have scale, it would never be big enough. Also, it would be hard to put a tree that's very heavy on this terrace because we didn't have the load capacities. And so I decided to maybe almost do the inverse of putting a big tree, making this screen with planters, because I was thinking if you're in your room, you want to have a bit of privacy from the communal spaces where there's a bar, there's a restaurant here, there's a bar there, there's not a restaurant there, there's like many things happening. And so we come up with this idea of using the structural U-beam on which the external passengers are made to use that to put in plant medium, drainage system, lighting system, humidity detectors, like the irrigation system. So this was a whole work that we did with the architects, trying to optimize the beam, these beams, as a hidden planter. And of course, they always wanted to make it smaller, I always wanted to make it bigger. So it was this whole back and forth to come to the right section. And here everything is in the section where we planted 500 climbers, and you hardly see the planter because of the detail of the railing. And so in the courtyard, you see the same tree ferns that we saw before. And around it, you have these 500 climbers that bring smell, they bring color, they bring a microclimate by the transpiration of their leaves. And so you're again not so far from the other place, in the middle of Fitzrovia. You enter through the door, and suddenly you're in this kind of very strange atmosphere. And it's interesting because it's hard to describe, because it makes you think of things you might have seen in Thailand or Vietnam or in Ecuador, this kind of subtropical atmosphere, but you're in the center of London. And I remember the first reviews we had is people saying it's amazing, but it won't last. This is totally crazy. And so we're 3-4 years later now, and the garden is thriving. It's again based on this microclimate that we make in cities. We forget that cities are artificial environments that we make for ourselves, and we have to find the right plants to put in that artificial environment. Another picture of it. He also asked me to make a glass house, and I made a glass house only with medicinal plants. To also go back to the idea that plants back in time were the only medicine we had. And also to bring back this idea of everything comes from plants. The food comes from plants, the clothes come from plants, the air you breathe comes from plants, the vaccines you get, or the medicines you take, most of that is all directly related to plants. From London, I go to Paris. Different type of projects. We're in La Défense, which you might know. This is the arch of La Défense, and where a developer found a possibility to put about, I think, 1,000 micro pillars into the ground to build a skyscraper on top of an urban boulevard. So this is the axe going to the Tuileries. This is this as they call it, the knit, and here there's a road. I'll show you a detail, I think. So here is this road where they found, I think, about 1,000 possibilities to put in a foundation and to cover the road with a new slab, and on top of the slab, this new skyscraper. So they asked me to come up with a landscape on top of this 4,000 square meters of slab floating above the road. And it made me think of the Mont Blanc in several ways. It made me think of the Mont Blanc because all these buildings reflecting the light look a bit like glaciers, if you want to. All the staircases, all these hardscape made me think of these bare rocks. And I was wondering, where's the tree line? Where, as you may know, the tree line in a mountain is the altitude above which no trees grow. It's always a very strong element in high altitude. And I was wondering, could we introduce a tree line into this mountainous landscape? And so we decided to bring in as many trees as we could. And so to go beyond composition, not trying to make it look nice, but just trying to think as nature would, in a very opportunistic way. How much trees can we possibly bring in the site? And I remember the building permit obliges to have 9 trees, and we planted 100. So how do we do that? We looked at the possibilities in the slab. Well, we only had 50 centimeters of soil, but we made sure we had a continuous soil, because some trees, as you may know, grow in shallow medium because they have more surface. And so we made almost a continuous fertile plant medium on those 4,000 square meters, having enough volume to bring in big trees. And so from the restrictions, for example, the beams, from restrictions of the fire truck access, the ADA access, we made a kind of reading of all the places where we could not plant. And then we just tried to plant everywhere else. And again, without making a composition. And for us, it was very liberating to not try to make a composition, but to try to think as nature would do, opportunistically and very very optimistically. So those trees were planted, as you can see here, and then we made a continuous flooring with granite slabs, just like you would be in the mountains. Both the staircases are in massive granite, the railings are in massive granite, the flooring is in massive granite, as you can see here. And so there's this little piece of mountain in between the glaciers of these skyscrapers. The floor is totally independent of the earth, so it's not crushing the earth. It's an independent structure that allows the roots to grow everywhere and to have a small opening around the trees themselves. And so I like these pictures where you almost see the kind of sequence of peaks as you would while walking in the mountains. So just planted, give it a couple of years, and you will have your urban forest right in La Défense above an urban boulevard. And then I go to the let's say our main projects of this last years, the Parc des Ateliers in Arles, where I am right now. I'm right now in this building, where Maya Hoffman from the Luma Foundation is building an art center. Main building is built by Frank Gehry. The renovation of these 19th century factory buildings is done by Annabelle Selldorf, and we have been working on the landscape surrounding all those buildings. Now, what's interesting to know is that this site was made in the 19th century by the railroad company to build locomotives. And so you have these very industrial, very rational buildings on a perfectly horizontal slab that they dug out of the bedrocks right adjacent to the Roman city of Arles. Back in the Roman days, it was the second most important city of the Roman Empire. And I was wondering from the first days, like this kind of emptied out space, this kind of neutral canvas in rocks and concrete, what kind of landscape do you make on that? Because there's no going back to what was there before, because before it was a slope and now it's bedrock. So there's no soil, there's no earth, there's no water, there's no roots, there's no plants, there's just nothing. Only a desert state of a climate. And it would be, I mean, when the factory is closed, it would be opened once a year for the rencontre, the festival of photography. And people would visit exhibitions in those industrial halls. But going from one to the other was such a difficult passage through 40 degrees of heat, no trees, no water, totally desert state of the site. And so there was this effect of this white canvas, and then around the city of Arles, this amazing richness of landscapes, but also of biodiversity, from the Kro, which is an ancient riverbed of a glacier, to the Camargue, which is the estuary plain between the Rhone and the Mediterranean, to the Alpi, which is the southern branch of the Alps. And so you get, I think, apart from the Amazonian rainforest, this is one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. Very different eco-regions, if you like, very close to each other. And they all seem to kind of want to go to the site. And so I was wondering, could we use the textures of those three landscapes? Could we use their logics to produce a new type of landscape? The logics of growing within little cracks in the rocks, the logic of growing within the strong mistral wind, the logics of growing into water with different levels. So we imagined, could we find or imagine a new hybrid landscape made by these the logics of these three surrounding landscapes. This then was connected to the city of Arles with this loop of trees that we also discovered to be there and that we saw as an important element of the design. So using the logics, okay, but how does that come into a project? Well, we decided to imagine what would happen if we would do nothing. If we don't do anything for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, how would nature come back? And so we worked with many consultants from Transolar to botanical, to ecological, to specialists in plant life, specialists of bird life, and we try to imagine that the wind would bring sediments to the site. These sediments would create a topography. That topography would create an ecology, and that ecology would then define the different types of plants that would grow on them. So in a very, I would say, analytical and intuitive way at the same time, we try to imagine how life would come back to the site. There was a zone where we could not dig because there's archaeology underneath. So we decided to dig where we could, use that to make our topography formed by the wind, by the Mistral. And then in function of depth, to plant this vegetation, where we discovered a very interesting asymmetry that in summer, the soft slope is in the shade of the trees, while in winter, when you want to be in the sun, let's say the steeper slope is protecting you from the colder Mistral winds. And so we applied this system throughout the site. And then based on the depth of soil, we decided the type of plants we could grow. And of course, these would be the pioneer plants that would come early when there's only 2-3 centimeters of soil. While, let's say 100 years, 200 years later, pine trees could grow in about 150 centimeters of soil. So what was interesting is that if you walk on site, the movement through space becomes a movement through time. I've said that there was no water on site, but there is a canal dug in the 16th century to irrigate the Gros, of which I spoke before. And we discovered that all the water that passes next to the site is dumped into the Rhone. So it's a kind of excess water, which brought us to the idea to pump this water into a new pond that we excavated, use the pond as a filtering element, and to then use that filtered water to irrigate the whole park. So it is highly natural, but it's highly artificial at the same time. So here you see a view from the top of this topography, looking over the pond, all the new trees, looking at the building of Frank Gehry. There's some more images. And so we're looking not for a 19th century romantic park, but a kind of wild park in which all the organisms by themselves would become an entity that lives, that changes, that allows people to visit it, but in a way is self-sufficient as well. Technical sections, so very precise build-up of this topography that we made mostly with materials we found in the surrounding areas that we brought on site, and then through a precise GPS modeling, all our wind studies were built on site and then planted with these trees, both big trees, medium trees, and small trees. In this idea here, you see on the top of the hill, this is 200 years later, if you would like, while going to the more shallow earth, we go into more pioneer species. And so we get this forest within this industrial complex, following its own logic. And and developing its own identity, I would say. So in a way, this is a picture taken a couple of months ago, but you see this kind of new alliances between these different types of trees, these different types of shrubs, of lower vegetation. So it's very exciting to see how from this idea of bringing life back to a site, how it is actually happening right now. Voila, I think that's the approach I wanted to show you. So from the Albanian section to the microclimate in London, to the mountainscape, I would say, in La Défense, and then to finally to this project, which is, I think, the most complex I've done so far in my career, since most of the times we make situation better, but here there was nothing to make better, since we were working on a concrete or a stone slab with no water and no soil. So it's really about creating this life on site. And what's really, and then I'll end with that, what's because I can see it right now. I'll show you. What's nice is that suddenly this life brings new life. So birds are coming back. Show you peak of the building. So if you scratch in the earth, there's worms there that we didn't bring there. They're there now, and so this. I'm really interested in this idea of bringing life to a site and then letting it live in a certain way. So in the coming years, the idea is to follow up how it evolves, how the roots grow, how temperature goes down, how much evaporation we get in the lake, to really kind of monitor this living organism that we've put in place. Thank you very much. I'll stop the share screen so we can see each other.
Thank you so much for this extraordinary lecture. It was really great that you actually ended up with the construction side, and actually you also ended up with the importance of monitoring and actually taking care of the development of a project. And how it actually lives by itself. And I think this is also, of course, it's important in architecture as well, because things are changing, but actually the change, it's so much more evident and so much more important factor when you are designing as landscape architect. Could you maybe extend on this specificity of your work, because you are, I mean, you spoke of so many amazing things, and especially in the last project, it was like you wanted to recreate the evolution, which is kind of, you know, challenging the space-time dialogue in such an extreme version, and maybe this would be an anchor to which you could maybe extend the importance of change and then the development that go sometimes beyond your designed version of it. So how do you see that?
I'll speak to architects. I think there's a very, I mean, I speak many times with architects. I work with many architects, and I like working with architects. I mean, I am an architect myself, but I've then been trained in landscaping, so I consider myself a landscape architect, not an architect, or an architect of landscapes, if you like. But I think the big difference is, as an architect, you still make an object. Your program is a very written out program, so many square meters for this one, and then you put that into an object, and that object you build. In landscape, we have no program and no object, because where does it stop? Where does it end? A tree that I decide to keep, is it my tree? Or is it not my tree? Where in the end, for people walking around here, where does the project start and end? There is no, you cannot objectify it, which means that you have a very different relationship with what you're building, because you're trying to make things better, but you never own it in a sense. And so we're much more about transformation. We try to start something that then takes its own course. Some trees will die, some trees will become very big. Some plants will make new plants, other ones will grow in a rhizome. So it's really about transformational force that you put in place, and that you then kind of say, go, make it happen. And that I think is, as an architect, I think it's important to really also think. I mean, we're trained to think in time, because you plan small, it becomes big. So I think as an architect, it would be wonderful to also think in time, and because we often say that the best moment for an architect is when the building is just finalized, so it makes his pictures and then whatever. Our best moment is when we're dead. You know, our best moment for the park. I mean, Central Park is better now than when Olmsted built it. So in that sense, I think that we're always trying to think in a transformative way, and not in an object way. And I think those two are different. And I think you should consider both.
Yeah, that was extremely clear. I think we should be more and more encouraged to think in time, also if we are by any chance doing the buildings, because the things could change, and thinking in time could actually lead you to different methodology, as you spoke about, let's say before. Another question before we go to Jakob and maybe the public. What it was so obvious, regardless of the scale of your project, you were extremely sensitive, but also extremely precise in deep reading of the site. And I think this is, of course, also related to the profession of landscape architects, because it drives, or you have to be, from the temperature to the soil structure and so on. But what was for me extremely fascinating with the last project, where there was nothing on your side, you started to understand the wider region, and then trying to recreate that specificity of this kind of biodiversity, diversity of the landscapes around Arles into the site itself. Could you maybe also speak a little bit more of where and how? Of course, you pointed out through specific projects, this understanding, and of course you also show that through the history of landscape painting, and of course understanding of the mountains, and for someone coming from man-made almost landscape, I think it's quite fascinating in the depth of sensibility you are able to produce, and where you see opportunities to highlight something. This, I think, it's extraordinary.
Yep. And that's why I started with these landscape paintings, because to not forget that landscape is a way of looking at things in the first place. And if you think away the retaining wall in Himara, it's a whole different city, except that they didn't do that for so many years. And so in that sense, I like to go into detail of an understanding of a site to then transform it from within the site. So it's a kind of hacking in the logics of what makes a site that site. If I showed London, it's that it can also be invisible, because in the end, I was really struggling in the beginning with Arles, because there's nothing. I mean, I'm used to making these readings, and every reading came out blank. There was like no vegetation, no topography, no hydrography, no parcels, no build. I mean, but in the end, we decided that basically the wind and the sun built the project, and with the logic of the surrounding landscape. So I think these readings are extremely important to see the potential of a site and the potential of transformation, and how to tap into that. And often saying in my studio, each project should be a discovery. If you don't learn something about the site that you didn't know before, you're not making a project, you're just applying something you already know. So which I tried to say in the introduction, we try to apply this methodology, this very rigorous reading of a site combined with an intuitive approach. We try to apply that so that after having made the project, for us, the site is transformed as well. We try to do the Turner trick on ourselves. And that demands, at the same time, patience, because if you go too fast, you force yourself into seeing something that maybe is not the right thing to see, and it demands rigorous analysis. So it's really about those two at the same time, like doing the analysis at home and on site, trying to to understand something that you couldn't understand at home.
Yeah, you know, when you were speaking about, I realized that actually you are dealing a project around Frank Gehry building, which is famous for actually multiplying his projects regardless of a site sometimes. So how do you see his project for Arles in relationship to what you were just speaking about, this site specificity and building up the identity upon this rigorous reading of the site?
I'm not an architecture critic, but for example, in Arles, he really played with the light of Van Gogh, and that's also one of the things that comes back in this book from Alain Roger, who also cites Oscar Wilde, saying that Van Gogh, for example, exemplifies the light of Arles. So again, this kind of idea that you need this artist to read a site in a different way. But I think that's the real trick is to find a way of hacking into the process that produces reality. And I like to use the word hacking because that's really trying to get into the logic of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jakob, it's your turn for questions and everyone who's joining us in the comments.
Thank you very much, Bas. Thank you, Tina. I will try to have one quick one and then leave to others to ask as well. So I wanted to maybe pick up on this notion of how to measure perhaps the success of your projects, in particular the one in Arles. I remember when I was in Arles, I think 1.5 years ago, you gave a mini presentation about the project, and you mentioned that the only way to measure the success of this project is by counting the amount of migrant birds mistaking your pond for the Camargue. And I thought that's kind of an interesting, let's say, assessment. So I'm wondering, okay, that's one way to do that for Arles, but do you have any other, let's say approaches for other projects, how you measure so-called success?
So in Arles, and I remember very clearly, it was at the moment right in the beginning of the project where everybody was speaking about how many people would come visit, and then the numbers of the success was then being measured by the increase of people visiting, and it was a kind of saying that for me the park is not successful because many people visit the park. So I thought if the park can really appeal to migrating birds, because there's many of them in Arles, that would be the success of the park. And so we went further with that, and we asked the Tour du Vala scientific center here in the Camargue to do accountings before, during construction, after construction. So we will have the proof of birds coming or not coming. But I must say, on the construction side, every day around 5, when the noise stops and the work stop, birds are coming already, even if the water is not in the pond yet. So here that was specific to this idea of making an independent organism. In other projects, it's often we try to experiment with plantation, and so we have kind of little ambitions for ourselves, like how do things grow, how do they work? Of course, how do people use it? If you make a playground, you want kids to come for sure. But we always try to put some ambitions into the project that we not explicitly would say to the client, but that we for ourselves would like to test. But here the birds, of course, with Arles, with the Tour du Vala, with the migration paths, made sense to take that as a reference for its success.
Great, thank you. So I would open it up to questions from the audience. There's one in the chat. I will just read out loud. Hi Bas, you were recently tasked with the redesign of the north-south connection in the center of Brussels, a real urban wasteland. How will you work there to transform the space? From Tom M. van der Becken.
But that's a whole. It's not in my presentations yet because we were just awarded that project. So that's a lot of explication. But it's a very specific urban forest we're making based on contour lines and based on the north-south junction. And to say it in 2 words, the north-south junction is a tunnel that passes through the city, and I'm reading it as a dike, as a barrier. So instead of seeing as a barrier of people, I'm reading as a positive barrier to hold all the rainwater back. So we hold the rainwater back and then plant. That was the kind of trick of the north-south junction. Unfortunately, I have to leave you because I have to do a sidewalk here on site. So I can take one more question, but then I really need to go downstairs.
Is there anybody else from the audience, maybe even asking directly or writing?
But it was great. I like to do it fast and good.
Okay, can I do the last one and then you're off to go to the site? Is that okay or not?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Just the last one, because it was so extraordinary to see your interdisciplinarity, you know, so somehow collaborating with engineers, with scientists, how you are bringing that into not only the project itself, but also in order to use the project into something that would transform the reality there. Can you, and that was really in Arles explicitly showed with understanding of the wind, sun, and kind of the trick of the development. Can you just somehow state something that actually through your 15, 20 years of practice shows the biggest importance of being able to collaborate and actually draw out even stronger concept through that collaboration?
I think it's a bit like the openness to the site is the openness to other people. If you have to collaborate with artists and with architects, they all have their own idea of things. So the collaboration already helps you to look at the site in a different way. So I think collaboration is essential also to put yourself in a humble way, like we're all here. We're all trying to come together to a new understanding of a site. That for me is collaboration.
Thank you so much. You are all equipped. We are really, I think you're also saying the importance of being on the site, and actually that's like an extremely important part of being landscape architect or an architect. Thank you so much, Bas, for your time and your expertise. All best to Luma. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.